working. So thank you all very much for coming out on a fine Saturday, August afternoon when you should be at the beach to hear about the heritage of Johnnie Mack's mud house in Tullaroe, County Clare. So I have two disclaimers. I'm biased in this story. Johnnie Mack was my grandmother's first cousin, so I've known about his house while he was alive and ever since he died back in 1981. And the second disclaimer is I might be a self-taught genealogist and a bit of a local historian, but I'm certainly not an archaeologist. So you will be getting more genealogy and family history than you will archaeology. But there's been lots of great archaeological work done by Dave Pollock, and I'll be talking about that a little bit as well. So let me just show you some pictures first to give you an overview of the house we're talking about. I've laid out some pictures there on the stage. We should have moved the chairs out of the way so that you can come up and look at them afterwards. This house first came to widespread attention when the book, which is down there, Clare History and Society, was published. That's part of 20 years ago now, I think, and it includes a large collection of County Clare photographs by the late Sonia Shorman, who was very active in the Shannon Archaeological and Historical Society. And one of them is one of two photos which she took of this mud house at Eyres Cross. I'll show you a map in a minute. They were taken about 2001. At that stage, the house was up for sale. As you can see, there's a for sale sign. In the course of the archaeology, the remnants of that for sale sign turned up in the debris. The sale never went through because planning permission was refused in 2001 on the grounds that the site was too small, A, to build a house far enough back from the corner not to pose a hazard to traffic, and B, to put in a septic tank far away enough from the house not to cause another sort of problem. So the house became progressively more overgrown. I think Sonia thought that the demolition had gone ahead. So if you read Clare History and Society, it says demolished 2001. That now can be changed to partially demolished 2025. These are photos that were taken in 1978 when the descendants of the immigrants from the house came back from Chicago. This is Nancy Pappas, formerly Nancy Garrett, whose grandmother was Mary Ann McNamara, who grew up in this house. These are the best photos we have of what a vernacular house of its type looked like from the inside when it was lived in. You can see the crane there over the open fire and the hearth. There's a view of another corner. I think that this mug is a Kilrush ceramics mug of a very familiar pattern. So not quite as old as the house. There's Johnny, the man who spent his entire 95-year life living in this house with his American relatives. There's Johnny by the fireplace with this lovely little cubby hole where he kept the alarm clock. That has survived in the ruin. It's still visible there today. That was to keep things dry by the fireplace in the old days. There's Johnny and the visitors outside the house, which was nicely thatched and whitewashed in 1978. And there it is from across the road. Already there's a lot of foliage growing up. So what really became the hazard to road safety at this crossroads, I think, was as much the foliage around the house as the actual building itself. I just noticed recently, I was reminded the electricity pole on the corner. He did have electricity. He did not, I understand, have running water in the house. This is the north side of the house. There doesn't appear to be any windows. In the course of the archaeology, it was decided that there probably was a window somewhere behind the bushes, and then at a later stage, it was decided, no, that was misidentified. This is a sketch that was done by Richard O'Cronin, or Dick Cronin, as some of you may know him. He was the conservation officer for many years for Clare County Council. And he visited the house on a number of occasions, including back in 2001, when it was first thought to be in danger of demolition. He went back in November of last year, and while the place was still very much overgrown with a minimum of foliage clearance, he put together this sketch showing the different parts of the house. I should possibly show you some maps. I might come back to these after you've seen a map so that you know exactly where the house is. Dave Pollock, who did the more detailed archaeological work in recent months, has put together this fantastic computer model showing the entire house from both the southwest corner at the bottom and from the northeast corner at the top. I'll talk about those different sections later on as well. And sadly, here's the digger. The end of the house had to go to make way for road safety works. And that happened at the end of June. But everything has been mapped, documented, carefully analysed, and is available for students of vernacular architecture for generations to come. This is what it looked like way back in November. Michael was there in the front row, and my cousin Cindy from America, pictured at the gable wall of the house. It gives you an idea of how overgrown the whole thing had become by the end of 2024. And there's another view of what's left today. The haggard at the southern side of the house has been gravelled over, and we're still awaiting the details of a conservation management plan for what's going to happen the remainder of the site. And it was a traffic problem. There were yield right-of-way signs on the corners. I don't know why they weren't stop signs if it was such a dangerous junction. I did suggest to the county council, maybe you should just put up traffic lights. But that yield right-of-way sign was still in the debris the last time I was there. And that is another view of it taken back in May during the vegetation clearance. So that is the end of the introductory slideshow. This is a map from the Ask About Ireland website based on the records held in the valuation office in Dublin. You can just about see AROE across the map. This is the townland of Tullaroe. Many of the locals will be familiar with it. From Kilrush, if you head west to Kilkee, you turn left at Lisdean Church, you go over Blackwear Bridge, you follow the road round a couple of bends down towards Querrin, and you come down this way to the crossroads. As you can see on this map, this is the 1840 Ordnance Survey, first edition, 6-inch to a mile map, overlaid in 1855 with the farm boundaries from Griffith's valuation, which was used as the basis of the poor law rates, etc. at that stage. So there is no road heading from Lisdean down to Querrin. There is a T-junction here. The house we're talking about, you can see me pointing with my cursor there, I think, is in the corner of plot number 36A on the corner of that T-junction. So let me go back now that I've given you some visuals and give you some text information. First of all, these notes that I'm working from are on my own website. The only note that you need to take is the address of the website, pwaldron.info/National Heritage Week 2025, all lowercase, no spaces. We're going out live on YouTube. It seems to be working. If you want to hear me all over again, or if you know anybody else who couldn't be here who wants to hear me, the YouTube link is there. I put it up on my Facebook page this morning as well. It's gone out by email to the society mailing list as well. So who was Johnnie McNamara? He was born in October 1885 in that house at Tullaroe Cross. He died in hospital in 1981 after only a couple of weeks in hospital. He spent over 95 years living in the house. He was one of a family of 7. He was the last survivor. The house is significant as one of the last inhabited, partly mud-built houses in County Clare. I'll talk about 1 or 2 others before the end of the talk. He was known as Johnnie Mack. He was a bachelor farmer, never married, had sisters living with him up to the mid-1950s, but for the last 25 years of his life, he lived alone. So that's why it looked a bit like a bachelor pad in the old photographs from 1978. At the end of last year and the start of this year, this rare example of pre-famine Irish vernacular architecture stood at a critical crossroads, and that was both literally and metaphorically. The neighbours had been complaining that somebody was going to get killed. This was a very dangerous junction, and the question was how much of the vernacular architecture could be saved consistent with road safety. So I was reminded of Blake's Corner in Ennistymon, which has been making the headlines in County Clare and further afield for decades probably at this stage, where there are two vernacular houses, possibly not even as old as Johnnie Mack's house, and they have been added to the record of protected structures, and that junction causes traffic chaos around Ennistymon right through the tourist season, and there are plans to build ring roads and other things to avoid it. I thought that there might be a simple solution for a rural crossroads like this, but unfortunately we have lost some of the architectural heritage. So eventually in the spring, Dave Pollock, who's based down in Waterford and may be watching us on YouTube, greetings Dave if you are watching, he sent me loads of information for this talk. He was appointed by Clare County Council in cooperation with the Heritage Council, and we're grateful for the funding from both of those bodies to record as many details as possible of the house and to supervise the road safety work so as much as possible might be saved for future historians, etc. So what sort of heritage could I talk about today? It's National Heritage Week. Heritage comprises lots of different things. I'll talk first about the landscape in which the house is located. I'll talk about the genealogy of the families who've lived in the house and who emigrated from it. There may be one or two descendants of the emigrants watching us on YouTube. A bit about the vernacular materials from which the house was constructed. And I'll talk about some of the oral history of the house and its residents as retained in local memory, which I have recorded from a couple of the neighbours in recent weeks. So I'm going to draw heavily on what Dave Pollock has done and with what I've learned from his neighbours, from Johnny's neighbours, Tommy Heafy and Liam Sullivan. Tullaroe is a townland. The townlands as we have them today were finally mapped and solidified both in spelling and in boundaries by the Ordnance Survey in the late 1820s into the 1840s. In some of the older records, you see Farranvullen rather than Tullaroe. Clare Libraries has some wonderful maps going all the way back to 1659, which allow us to look at the landscape of Tullaroe back in those days. So this is the 1659 map where it is called Farranwillian. Tarman is the townland to the north of it. This is Palnisherry Bay over to the right. Kilnagalloch, you're probably familiar with. Ballyrot is now known as Shangana. Querrin down here is part of Querrin. Berta Clare is Clarefield, just a more literal rendering of the Irish version. And over here you have Kilfeera, and you have the old church in Kilfeera marked. There's one gable of that church still standing in Kilfeera Cemetery. It was the Catholic parish church before the Reformation. It remained the church for the established church until the modern 1840s on the Carrigaholt Road in Kilkee town was built, and then that fell into ruin. And down here you have Kilnagalloch, another of the oldest churches in the entire county, with a history dating back to the time of St. Senan. So the straight line between those two would eventually be the east-west road through Tullaroe, but there's it all really shown on this map. But if we move on to Petty's 1663 map, it's not as detailed, quite similar. You see the tail end of Dunaha over there. Again, the church is marked up there. The next one is Pelham's 1787 map, where you now have a lot of shading to illustrate the bogs. Tullaroe was very much bog. It supplied turf that was shipped up the Shannon Estuary to heat Limerick City and other glitch. This is 1787. Now the two churches are marked, Kilnagalloch and Kilfeera, but Tullaroe is largely bogland. So then we move on to 1842, the Ordnance Survey map. There's two versions of this. And there's our little T-junction before the crossroads appeared. That's the same one that I showed earlier, and that one has less detail. St. Martin's Well is also on this road. So we know that this road, which is not on Pelham's map in 1787, was constructed sometime between 1787 and 1840 when the Ordnance Survey did the mapping. We know that the north-south road, which is not on this map, had to be constructed sometime after 1840. And if we move on to the very last open street map today, you can see the north-south road there. And an awful lot of the old bogland in Tullaroe is now forestry. I think what I was saying when our link dropped is that there was cutaway bog on both sides of this road from Tullaroe down to Querrin, and sometime around the 1950s, I think it was closed for a number of months so that the road could be lowered to the level of the surrounding cutaway farmland. Closed for 2 years, Michael O'Connell is telling. So now let me go back, and now that we know what it looked like, I've told you most of those things. I think that road from Kilfeera to Kyle-na-Galock would also have been the main road to Kilrush at the time. It went down by St. Martin's Well, down to the ferry at the mouth of Palnasherry Bay, across the bay by ferry and into Kilrush through Carnacalla. So it was a very busy road. That's the road. I'll come later to the story of the Camogue drowning tragedy during the famine years. People from the Loophead Peninsula heading to the workhouse in Kilrush would have taken that road to Kilrush and taken the ferry across. The road to the north wasn't there because Blackbird Bridge only dates to the late 1700s. So the only way into that area between Blackweir and Querrin was either from the west or across Palnasherry Bay on the ferry. So now the old east-west road is the minor road with yield signs, and the north-south road has become the main road and has become the Wild Atlantic Way. And the house is aligned with the road, so it seems that it was built after the road. If we go back to our other map here, you will see that the road is running diagonally. The field boundaries are running east-west and north-south. The road is at a slight angle to that. So the conclusion is the road came first, then the house, and that the road was going direct from Kilfeera to Kyle-na-Galock and not respecting the field and farm boundaries in between. They're not all straight, but mostly they are. So what do we know about the people who lived in Tullaroe? We have a number of sources. The tied-up plotment books, in this case, were compiled in 1827. They list everyone who was liable to pay a tithe to the established church, or the United Church of England and Ireland, as it was officially called under the Act of Union at the time and before disestablishment in 1870. They were not just members of the established church. Members of all churches were liable for tithes to the Protestant minister. I already mentioned Griffith's valuation in 1855. That also gives us a list of all the occupiers and details of the poor law rates which they were liable to pay to the poor law guardians for the upkeep of the workhouse in Kilrush. So here's the list of names. You can see Behan was not there in 1827. It was there in 1855. So was Brillahan, a very rare surname, which even in 1855 got confused with Behan because nobody had heard of it. Burns, Carmody, Carney and Conway had disappeared. Corbetts were still there. Costellos were still there. So there's a lot of changeover. But that 28-year period between those two lists of occupiers covered the famine years. By 1855, here's our list of occupiers in Tullaroe in 1855. The second column is the occupier. The third column is the immediate lessor or the landlord. In some cases, there was a middleman subletting property. There are two landlords, Randall Burrow William and Plain Randall Burrow. Randall Burrow Williams' estate was in Chancery. That's a legal term. If you think of it in terms of recent years, he was in Nama. He was in financial difficulties. They were an uncle and a nephew. One lived in Querrin House, which is still occupied by his descendants, Randall Coonahan, etc., and the other lived in Kappa outside Kilrush. And the house we're interested in, the numbers on the map that I showed you are some years after this, and the map was redrawn a few times. I'll show you that in a second. But the site we're interested in is numbers 14 and 15 on opposite sides of the corner, occupied by John Behan. He had a house on one corner, he had land only on the other corner. He was renting from two different members of the borough family. So that east-west road was obviously used to divide the borough estate between probably two brothers originally, and at this stage it's divided between an uncle and a nephew. So let me go back to the map. We have several versions of this map. This is after 1855. If we go to the black and white version, that's practically the same, but there's an earlier black and white version, and you can see that plot number 14 got renumbered to plot number 36A. So number 14 is the plot that we're interested in, and number 14 was just land. The building is there on the map. It was there in 1840 when the map was drawn. By 1855, it was not occupied. It had no rateable valuation. So it seems to have fallen into ruin somewhere between 1840 and 1855. Why would a house fall into ruin between 1840 and 1855? Let me go back and show you another list of occupiers from Tullaroe. Captain Arthur Kennedy is hopefully familiar to many of the locals here in Kilrush. He was the poor law inspector sent to take over from the elected Board of Guardians when the situation got out of control under the famine. He too lived in Kappa, and he is reputed to have become so angry with the local landlords for the mass evictions that they were carrying on. He one day said he felt like taking down the gun from the back of the door in his house in Kappa and going out and shooting the first landlord he met. So he began sending reports to the poor law commissioners in Dublin, outlining the scale of the evictions, the destitution, the starvation going on in Clare. And he compiled lists of the families who were evicted or ejected and whose houses had been thrown down, right through the Kilrush Poor Law Union, which stretched from Quilty to Killadicert and back to Loop Head. And one of his lists covers the townlands of Tullaroe and Shinagana. He wasn't using the standardized Ordnance Survey spellings of the townlands. So we have a list here of the heads of 39 families. Some of those names we saw a minute ago on the tide allotment list. The interesting one is number 6 was Dennis Behan. 6 in his family, 4 males and 2 females. They were ejected. They were tenants at will. The yearly rent seems to be that they worked for the landlord for the rent and that they possibly had no land. So could that be how John Behan ended up with 2 farms, one on each side of the crossroads in 1855? Could one have been Dennis Behan's farm? Sorry, I'll go back to some of the other families. On the southwest corner of the crossroads, there was a John McNamara, by pure coincidence in 1855. No relation to the John McNamara who was the last occupier across the road on the southeast corner. I'm calling the 2 Randall boroughs Uncle Randall and Nephew Randall. So he was renting from the uncle. McNamara appeared between 1827 and 1855. Carmody disappeared. John McNamara and Bridget Carmody had a daughter baptized in 1858. So my hypothesis is John McNamara came from somewhere else and married into a Carmody farm, and the McNamaras lived on that southwest corner from 1855 up towards the end of the century. As I pointed out, John Behan had his 2 holdings, one under each of the 2 landlords, the nephews on the northeast corner and the uncles on the southeast corner. John Behan and Bridget Eyres had a daughter baptized in Carrigaholt Parish, also in 1858. Her surname was spelled E-A-R-S in the baptismal record. It's the same surname as the E-Y-R-E-S, which appears in the tithe allotment books. So my hypothesis is that John Behan came from somewhere else between 1827 and when his children began to be born around 1840 and married into the Eyres farm. Could he be related to the Dennis Behan whose family was evicted during the famine? Possibly. No way of proving it yet. I'm hoping that possibly DNA comparisons might confirm that relationship eventually. Where did the Behans come from? There is local folklore suggesting that they might have come from somewhere east of here, overside Kilrush, as we say, but no proof. There are Behans in Dunaha. Are there any of the Dunaha Behans here? No? I thought we might have one of them in the audience. And they used to visit Johnnie Mack in his mud house in Tullaroe, and they understood that they were related, but they're not able to document the exact relationship. The first Behan in Dunaha was Pat Behan, who was 79 when he died in 1915, so probably born just before the famine, if we can trust his age at death. People didn't have birth or baptism certificates in those days. They neither remembered nor cared nor knew when they were born in many cases. And their grief-stricken relatives after the death are even less likely to get the age right when they're registering the death. The story is he may have come out from the workhouse to work for the Connors family, and eventually in 1855, I think, he married the daughter of the Connors family in Dunaha, and there are still Behans living there today. Could he have originally been one of Dennis Behan's evicted family from the famine years? We don't know yet. It's possible. Another piece of evidence of the Behan-Eyres marriage, with a third different spelling of Eyres, is on the death record of Mrs. Catherine Walsh, who died in a place called Crawford County, Iowa, in 1911. Anybody been to Crawford County, Iowa? One person. Not the hotbed of emigration from Ireland to America, but there were lots of little places in America that were home from home for immigrants from places in Ireland. So one parish would transplant almost en masse to another parish or county in America. So lots of families from Kilkee, Carrigaholt areas ended up in Crawford County, Iowa. And I'll come in a moment to how I know that she's from the Tullaroe family. We can trace forward from the Valuation Office cancelled books. That link will bring you to the version on my website. Here's my local version. Let's go back up to the beginning because we know we're interested in Tullaroe number 14. This is basically Griffith's valuation updated for changes in occupiers, landlords, changed. So we'll go back to the very first book, Tullaroe number 6 to 21. So it's a handwritten version of the printed version I showed you earlier. And there's John Behan in number 14. And you see something new every time you look at an old record. The small letters indicate a building. The large letters indicate two separate plots of land with the same occupier. So here's number 14A, and there's a small a struck out. I never noticed that until I brought it up now. So that means that at the time of compiling of Griffith's valuation, it was recognized there was a structure on that southwest corner in plot 14. And there's number 15A. And eventually William Brew took over one side of the road. Robert Burrow inherited the other side of the road. And that's the two plots of land together. These are slightly out of line, are they? That's 14A, 14B, and 15 with the house. The third column there is the valuation. These are areas in acres, roods, and perches. Valuation of land in pounds, shillings, and pence. Valuation of buildings in pounds, shilling, and pence. The total valuation of land and buildings, just the sum of the other two columns. So by going through all those records painstakingly, I was able to put together the succession of occupiers of the two houses. As you saw, the plots were renumbered, the boundaries were redrawn, the landlords went into NAMA. It's a mess. But eventually I made some sort of sense of it. I actually began to wonder when I found that ejectment list in the archaeological survey. We had various repairs. So let me go back and show you the picture again as drawn, you know, a little more about the house. Here's the sketch. This is the northeast corner is the road corner. You have number 5 on that sketch is 20th century concrete. Number 1 on the inside in the beigey color is late 18th or early 19th century mud. The mud wall was wearing away, so it was reinforced with concrete just on the gable wall, a little bit on the north wall, and around on the south wall again, around the window. Here was the front door facing into the haggart, facing away from the road. Somebody planted 2 ornamental plants on either side of the door. They went bananas and took over the house. So it was impossible to get in and out through the door. The back door was the one actually out onto the road. This is where we thought there might have been a window. It now appears it's just where the mud wall had worn away. The other 2 shades, the brownie shade is stonework, but clay bonded stonework using a clay mortar instead of a lime mortar. The eastern end is more modern, late 19th century mortar bonded stonework. The tree is a sycamore tree, which grew up in the middle of the parlor floor during the 44 years in which the house was abandoned. So it appears that at some point, the mud-walled house was extended in stone, and then eventually in about the 1880s, this extension on the far end was built in a more modern type of stone. It's still 130 years old or whatever. So there are repairs on the building. The joins, in other words, the concrete work, the joins between the stonework and the mudwork in one point on the south wall, in another point on the north wall, the extensions in stone. And then you have yellow on top of the stone. So there was a course of mud on top of the stone walls and then a thatched roof on top of that. And we haven't been able to tell whether the roof was raised with mud, that originally there might have been a lower thatched roof sitting on the stone walls, and then it was raised a foot with mud and a higher thatched roof put on, or whether that was all original construction at the same time. Either way, there's been a lot of repairs done between 1787 and 1981. I just wondered, could the wreckers and the levelers during the famine have partially demolished the house? So I asked Dave this morning, and he said the repairs on the building are mostly repairing cracks that must have developed over time from shrinkage and settling. There's no sign of deliberate damage by an eviction crew. I originally guessed, before I went through all those valuation office records, that the Eyres family lived on the southeast corner where the present mud house is, and that's gone viral in various reports. I now realize that that might not be accurate, that the Eyres family might have lived on the northeast corner. The original McNamaras on the southwest corner disappear in 1891. The husband died in 1874, and the wife some years later. And John Behan Jr., the son of the 1855 occupier, took over on the southwest corner. For those of you who know it, that's now Liam Sullivan's field, and Liam built a new house the other side of that field in the 1970s, I think. John Behan Sr., the father, had died in 1881. That's how we know the man who took over in 1891 has to be the son. And he divided his land between his son, John Jr., and his son-in-law, Patrick McNamara, not related to the McNamaras across the road. He came from Craganock up near Mullack and married Bridget Behan. And I think at that stage, the Behans, the older couple, stayed on the northeast corner, and the ruin, as it probably then was, the unoccupied house on the southeast corner, was extended with the new stonework on the eastern end, and that became the McNamara home. But by 1894 or 1895, the house across the road was no longer in use, and everyone was living on the southeast corner. John Behan Jr. was out on his own between 1891 and 1901. He presumably sold or handed over the tenancy, if he hadn't bought it out, that farm to Burton O'Donnell, and he moved back in with his brother-in-law on the opposite corner, on the southeast corner. He died in 1919. Burton O'Donnell was living in Kilkee in Kincora House. He was a Burton Jr. as well, but Burton Sr. was dead, so the man who took over in 1901 has to be the junior. And he handed over the farm in about 1903 to his brother William O'Donnell, and William's the great-grandfather of Liam Sullivan, who still lives there. The Behans had a shop. I heard from May Morrissey, formerly May Talty, who I visited frequently right through my childhood in Tarman. She grew up in Rahanishka. She went to Querrin school, and on her way home from school, the highlight was to call into Lizzie Behan's shop at Eyres Cross to buy sweets. The question is, which corner was Lizzie Behan's shop on? I understood from May that it was on the northeast corner, because back in the 70s and 80s, I remember farm buildings on the northeast corner. Liam Sullivan thinks it was in his field on the southwest corner. And during the roadworks recently, the council also cleared some foliage and plants from the southwest corner. And between Liam and the council workers, they have found the remnants of the house that used to stand on the southwest corner. And that may have been where the shop was, or she may have had it there and then moved it to the other corner at a later date. In the 1901 census, we begin to have a lot more detail. Here's a list of all the families in Tullaroe, including 2 McNamara families. 2 Patrick McNamaras came from up the country and married into farms in Tullaroe. The Patrick from Craganock that we're talking about married into the Behan farm. Another Patrick from Cree married into an O'Shaughnessy farm. So we have the interesting phenomenon if we look at the house and building return for the 1911 census. My handwriting is rather small, and you may or may not be able to read, but you can see house number 28, Pat McNamara, Shaughnessy, and house number 19 up at the top, Pat McNamara, Behan. Normally, if you have 2 people of the same name in the same townland, or even in adjoining townlands, they will be given a nickname or a patronymic usually to distinguish them. So I think of the 2 Michael McNamaras who lived out in Moveen and Breaffa, and to avoid confusion, I'd call one Michael Porig and the other Michael Anthony. But the people in Tullaroe didn't know who the fathers of the 2 Patrick McNamaras were. They'd come from 10 or 15 miles away, probably in pre-bicycle days even. So the only way they could distinguish them is give them their wives' names. So it was feminism before its time, and they became McNamara Behan and McNamara Shaughnessy. Not quite double-barrel names, but put it in brackets to avoid distinction. Because the postman, there were no air codes in that day, the postman needed some way of telling which Patrick McNamara is this letter for. So it would have the wife's maiden name in brackets. In the 1901 census, the other coincidence is the 2 Patrick McNamaras died in the same year, 1933. In the 3-room house in the 1901 census, we have 11 people living. Patrick McNamara from Craganock, his wife Bridget Behan, who probably grew up across the road on the other corner. All 7 children born within 6 years, starting with twins, including Johnny, who was 15. John Behan, who'd been out on his own on the southwest corner up to that year, had moved back in to the crowded house with parents and 7 children. And his sister Lizzie, or Eliza, who was running the shop either on the northeast corner or the southwest corner, was also living with her sister and her sister's family. So it must have been a very crowded house. There is evidence, we call it a 3-room house because there's a stone chimney breast dividing the western room and the center room, and then another stone wall dividing the center room from the eastern room. But there were wooden partitions. There was a wooden partition in the western room, and there were lofts overhead at both the western end and the eastern head. So they weren't quite all sleeping in one bed, but it was pretty crowded. By 1911 census, there's 9 people left because 2 of the McNamaras had gone to Chicago and were married with their own started their own families by 1911. So 3 sisters and 2 brothers stayed at home and never married. And 2 of the sisters were very shy and reclusive. And the story is they stayed below in the room. They never came out during the daytime. They never entertained visitors. My grandmother used to visit her first cousin in the house, and she'd be brought out to be shown something in the yard. And after 20 minutes walking around the yard, they'd go back in, and a beautiful tea would have appeared on the kitchen table as if by magic. But the 2 girls would have gone back into the room after getting the tea. They were not very good at registering births, marriages, and deaths. I can't find a civil marriage record for Patrick McNamara and Bridget Behan. I can't find civil death records for many of the family. The census also asked what materials are the houses built of. A pure mud house, plastered over and whitewashed. It was very hard to distinguish externally from a stone house. A house made partially of both materials is even harder to classify. So the classifications were stone, brick, or concrete, or mud, wood, or other perishable material. Many houses like this one were a combination of both. The enumerators in both 1901 and 1911 put this house down in the stone, brick, or concrete category. So they must have looked at the eastern end rather than the western end. Patrick or Patsy McNamara had the reputation of being kind of an untrained veterinary surgeon. He was often called on by neighbors who had a cow calving and were having difficulty delivering the calf or whatever. And it suggested that he neglected his own farm while off helping other farmers who presumably would pay him in kind, if not in cash, for his help with their animals. So what happened to the other people who lived in this house? Those who stayed died out by 1981. So let's look at the 3 surnames, Eyres, Behan, and McNamara, all with their different spellings. I mentioned earlier the Camogue Ferry Disaster Memorial, the 12th of December, 1849. 41 people drowned when their ferry boat sank. They'd been turned away from the workhouse here in Kilrush. They were going across on this rickety ferry boat, 100 yards or a couple of 100 yards across the mouth of Palnisherry Bay, and the boat sank. And they were starving with hunger, and they couldn't swim to shore, even they were so close to shore. And 2 of the names that were recorded were Richard Eyres and Jane Eyres. I suspect they may be related to the Eyres who lived in Tullaroe. We don't have a townland address. I think they may even still have descendants living locally. Michael O'Connell here was instrumental in getting that monument erected as part of the National Famine Commemoration, which we had here in Kilrush 12 years ago in 2013. There was another Lawrence Eyres who was living in Querrin in 1862 and died in 1905. I think he may have been a son of the Thomas who was in the Ty the Plotman book in 1827. The parish registers, Tullaroe is in the Carrigaholt, Mayarta, Kilballyowen parish, and the parish registers survive only from the early to mid 1850s. So we have no birth or marriage records to enable us to put together the Eyres family tree before those dates. There was a John Eyres who had a son, Thomas, who married 3 times, and he lived in Tullaroe in 1868. May have been related, don't have enough records or DNA from descendants to confirm that. John Behan and Bridget Eyres seem to have married around 1840. I know they had at least 8 children. They've well over 350 descendants up to the present time. Some of them actually left in Clare, many of them in the United States, possibly further afield. Mrs. Mary McGrath married in 1862. She registered her father's death in 1881. She died in Querrin in 1885. Her daughter Bridget married Clohessy. There are many descendants in the area from that family. Catherine Walsh, I mentioned earlier, went to Iowa, where she died in 1911. Michael seems to have been the intended heir. He married Mary Scanlon in 1871. Their 3 children were born in Tullaroe, and then Mary died in 1877, leaving 3 infant children. I can find no record of Michael after that death in 1877. She was married, not widowed. So he was still alive in 1877. His 3 children ended up in Iowa. He may have gone to Iowa with the children, but I'm told by Liam Sullivan that Johnnie Mack always talked about his uncle from Australia who came home and wanted Johnnie to go to Australia. So I'm wondering, did Michael somehow go to Australia and leave his children at home? Who was this mysterious uncle in Australia? Another sister, Margaret, married into a Keane farm in Shangana, which is southeast of Tullaroe, east of Querrin, adjoining townland. Patrick went to Crawford County, Iowa. He has many descendants living there. He married a woman called Elizabeth Keane. She's said to have been born in Querrin, and she emigrated to Crawford County, Iowa with her parents, who were John Keane and Abigail O'Donnell. So she's actually related to the O'Donnells who acquired the land on the opposite corner. Hopefully some of his descendants are watching on YouTube. I found a nice obituary for Patrick this morning, thanks to newspapers.com. There were typos in newspapers even in 1934. He appears usually as Behan. There's one place further down where he's Behan. Denison is usually spelled with a single N in the middle. He was 85. He'd been in Crawford County for 55 years. He went to visit his daughter in Omaha, Nebraska. Anyone familiar with American genealogy or American geography can tell me how far is Omaha from Crawford County. It's the next state, but it may not be too far away. He'd gone for the holidays. Even in 1934, they were just calling it the holidays rather than the Christmas as we call it here. He was brought back to Denison for burial. And it says he was born in Kilkee, which could encompass Tullaroe. The Americans might have heard of Kilkee in the 1930s. They wouldn't have heard of Tullaroe. Like pretty much every Irish Patrick who went to America, there were many of them. His birth date was reputed to be March the 17th, St. Patrick's Day. Plenty of others who didn't know their actual birth date, but knew the 4th of July was significant when they got to America, adopted that as their birthday. We don't have baptism records that far back. We can't survive that. He was 30 years old when he came to America in 1878, and within a year, he had married a girl who had emigrated with her parents from the next townland. Whether they knew each other at home or not, I don't know, and was survived by 7 children, predeceased by 2 others. And at least in that paragraph, it's B-E-H-E-N. And that was a common spelling. B-E-H-A-N and B-E-H-E-N have always been interchangeable. I think the B-E-H-A-N is much more common nowadays. And then we had the 3 Behans who we saw in the census: Bridget, Johnnie Mack's mother; John, the bachelor, who gave up the holding on the southwest corner; and Eliza, who ran the shop. She lived up to 1937. There were 7 in the next generation. Mary Ann married a man called Garrett from County Offaly, who she met in Chicago, married in 1909. She lived up to 1968. They have many descendants. I've met many of them. Eliza died in 1941, never married. Lucy died in 1955, never married. Can't find death dates for Delia or Patrick. And Michael went to Chicago, died in 1949. He has many descendants there. So I've talked a little bit about the construction, just to sum it up. The oldest part of the western end is built of mud, probably well before 1840, possibly as far back as 1787. The center part is stonework with clay rather than lime mortar, topped with that course of mud, which might have been to raise the roof. The extension at the eastern end was mortared, more modern stonework, probably in the late 19th century. And then you have a thick skin of 20th century concrete outside the western wall wrapping around. I was alerted to the significance of this house not long after Johnnie died in 1981. Mary Teresa Hines was the librarian in Kilkee for many years. She was the first one who drew it to my attention. Paddy Nolan, former vet in Kilkee, who died about 6 years ago now, brought it to the attention of Dick Cronin and the County Council in 2001. Pat Flynn from Ennis, whose specialist subject was the 4th-class house in County Clare in the 19th century. I brought him to visit it back around 1994. You've seen Sonia Shorman's photographs. My late father was well aware of it. So around the time it was up for sale in 2001, Dick Cronin visited it and said, "It is likely that the cob or mud will soon return to the earth." It hasn't actually returned to the earth until some of it was pulled down in recent weeks. It was not the policy, and still is not the policy, of Clare County Council to enter on the record of protected structures buildings in such poor condition as their protection and repair would not be practical. And unfortunately, that was the decision on this house. But he suggested that the house be properly surveyed, photographed and recorded, and perhaps even replicated in Bunratty Folk Park as an example of the type of house which made up more than 60% of dwellings in Clare during the mid-19th century. Well, that surveying, photography, recording has finally now taken place 23 years plus later. Whether it will be replicated in Bunratty Folk Park remains to be seen. I've brought many tour groups to the house over the years. During the National Famine Commemoration Week, 1 or 2 people in this room were there. We had 2 busloads of an international audience, including some of the most distinguished famine historians like Christine Keneally and Sean Sexton, and everyone was absolutely intrigued because you can actually see the mud and see it decaying. It's no longer covered in plaster and whitewash. And there were all sorts of discussions over lunch that day as to how can we restore or preserve this house, but nothing ever came of them. In 1849, late 1849, early 1850, the Illustrated London News sent a sketch artist over to West Clare with a journalist to report on the famine conditions. That was the worst period of the famine. That was when the ferry disaster happened while they were here. And some of the sketches published of villages in ruins, houses unroofed after evictions. It's hard to tell whether some of these represent, that might be a stone house, that looks more like a mud house, that might be a mud house. They're probably a combination of both. But the people who are familiar with these sketches ask, where are those houses today? All we can tell them is the mud sank back into the ground. And they could actually see that in Tullaroe as it happened in recent times. There's another one of Moveen. And that one looks mud, all thatched probably, all unroofed. The gables and the chimneys to a large extent probably were stone, but most of the walls were mud. And there was a similar village in Tullig. More of those looked like they might have been mud, but it's hard to be certain from the sketches. Any such houses which we have are of enormous historical, archaeological, cultural and emotional interest and significance and deserve to be studied and preserved. So just to give a review of what's happened over the last 9 months or so, in November, the County Council acquired, I think they might have acquired land on more than one corner of the crossroads, because they have done road safety works on multiple corners, and they proposed immediate demolition even before the vendor had been paid. They were not required to get planning permission. So I had promised the vendor I wouldn't kick up a fuss until he got paid, so I was left in quite a quandary. What do I do? So I said it to our secretary in Kilrussian District Historical Society, Paul O'Brien, who said, I'm going to put up a tweet. So he posted this on the 7th of November, tagged some people who we've probably forgotten about because that was shortly before the election, and Roisin Garvey is no longer a senator, Darragh O'Brien is no longer the Minister for Housing, Eamon Ryan is no longer a TD. And immediately, well, it was election time. First one out of the blocks was June Dillon, who was running for Aintu in Clare, said it would be tragic. Is there a planning application? As a heritage professional in Scotland with family links to this very townland, I'm very disappointed and concerned. How can I learn more and formally object? Such structures are precious, rare, and a tangible expression of our history. Think of the educational value. More and more similar comments. So I knew when I saw those that I'd probably done the right thing in drawing it to attention. So thankfully, John O'Malley in the West Clare Municipal District paused the works, and Dick Cronin, who had retired by that stage, was called back and visited on the 13th of November. Some initial vegetation clearance was done, and Dick did a preliminary study for the County Council and the National Monuments Service. If anyone is interested, I have a copy of Dick's study, which I'm not going to read out to you at the moment. The next thing that happened in February, even though that road, the north-south road, is part of the Wild Atlantic Way, it is a local road with an L number. I have no idea what the number is. I always say those numbers are for American tourists, not for locals. Excuse my typo there. The speed limits were reduced from 80 kilometers per hour to 60 kilometers per hour. That should have greatly improved the road safety. Unfortunately, there was a reasonably serious accident there around Easter. A car coming from the west didn't stop at the stop sign because there wasn't a stop sign to stop at. He didn't yield at the yield sign. He ran straight into a car coming from the north. So there were air ambulances, etc., called. But the house on the southeast corner wasn't obscuring the view of traffic coming from the north or from the west. More vegetation clearance was done under Dave Pollock's supervision in April. The County Council called a public meeting via a press release on the 23rd of April. I gave an earlier version of this talk at an event in Miles Creek on the 8th of May. We put out an appeal that night for volunteers to help with the rest of the archaeological work. The week starting the 19th of May, Dave and his son Alex, various local volunteers, the crew of the council staff under Joe Lannan, spent a whole week clearing out the interior of the house. The thatched roof had collapsed not long after Johnny died, so there was 40 years of debris, vegetation, fly tipping, people throwing rubbish into the house as they passed, etc. And we even had a visit from T.G. Cahir, so hopefully this might work. And I have to quickly unmute it. If it works.
Until Tullaroe grua in Acquisition Querrin a gown Lehman Floyd a has take Johnnie Mack femara took the red. Ta obertas the hinish on Shanahig Doibe County Sha Achlanu on Vasra Tarisha Mohtigel nach more Lechiad Blien.
2 trees that were planted either side of the front door, and they've kind of grown into the building and taken over, really, pulling down the walls, but kind of looks like a bit of a haunted house.
Tig stadiúlisathe a bhí tócathe le plodda aimsir an ghorta mór. Bhí sína beag chluthe chur leis a gahabnam líanta. Bhí conaí Johnnie McNamara sa tig seo go dtí 1908 ó héan, a cha bhfuair sé bás in níos an 9 Ó hin tá an tig díomhaoin agus ag meltig an sail is an aimsir in na meachnam líanta. Tá an tig bhailte chrosaide agus roiir cáhainte gad an móthir. Da var son ceannagan cóla cúnta an sí, agus bhí sé meáte chuid an dige legan go talamh, mar chuid a scéim fésathe bóthir. Ach dímpig an cuiste éireachta agus staire áitiúil an cóla cúnta an tig a chaibh nó.
Timppel 1808 tháinig Paddy McNamara tar tharla me sin seanathair Gaelgóra dúchas ó Craiganoch beidir Jano Cuig Níla thuasún an seo agus fós sé seach. Fós sé brídi Behan, agus an sin tháinig si an cónaí ar an taobh seat an bóthir agus tógú an cuid sin den seach.
Tá obertas na inis an teachtan seo ag an ggóir le féistúil an seandálaí Dave Pollock cúntas agus tá sí an tí chláróú solaníon for feiceile leis.
It's a matter of recording the debris that's lying around in it. Bits of the fallen structure, that kind of thing.
Tá an cinneal an tí legan chur latíban is ag an ggóir le cúnta agus tar béireacht an tí bon ina giad chéim eile dá bleanan sá.
So phase 2 will be to consider how we might consolidate the ruin, make it publicly accessible, interpret the site.
Dúirt ifigach éireachta an chóir le cúnta chun Johnnie Maguire go níon for go chaon éireachta is an tuige chosanta agus a chaibh nó, agus Robert mar anad éireachta le hinis ceann léime.
Given lum Gluid tar éis bás Johnny dúirt Mary Teresa Hines a bhí na leabharlaí ag IT sin seach am a spéisialta tá dearnach déanta de dul atá
between the mirror and floor.
Hogan take forward agus dói bishop fahim the Heiligen saw. Do os ciwn cil galeblian. Agus ces graf oil gan ach sé lacathe go talamh tásúla ní seofa. Go sé sóise fegnam líanta fada eile. Agus go gudi sé le sevenas aireachta cheann léna. Tomás ó man éon luacht tídí cahir. I geann léna an chláid.
Forgive my poor Irish. And I think we were a lot more optimistic at that stage about what might happen to the site. But unfortunately, as we've seen, most of the gable wall, which was the original mud structure, has had to go. But Jeff Hott and Dave Pollock came back the following week and did a laser scan of the whole building. And then the 25th of June, partial demolition took place. And cars were still flying along using Google Maps at 80 kilometers per hour until the last week or two, when Google finally woke up to the changes in speed limits that have been around since February. So we're hoping that there will be a conservation plan for the remaining structure. That has yet to be finalized. Dave has sent in a draft of his report. Again, he says I can give it to anyone who is interested. He's just waiting approval from Conjala Maguire that there's nothing else required at the moment. So there's lots of maps, pictures, etc. in that report, some of which you've seen already. Some much more detailed reconstructions, etc. So I'm not going to go through all that here. The last thing I might do is just give you some of Liam Sullivan's memories of Johnnie Mack. So we'll just play a little bit of this. I'm going to start about 30 seconds in, if I can figure out how to do that. I can't, so I just start
because we never started coming.
I'm done way in. Go back to 30.
When I was young, going to school, because Johnny was a bit contrary at that time. He didn't like young lads around his house or anything. So if we played handball up against the end of the house, he gave out about it. And he used to tell us, play it up against the ditch, but you couldn't play handball against the ditch. But then as I got older, I started going in with him. I suppose I went in the first time.
I'll stop you there, because the end of the house was interesting.
The end of the house.
The end of the house was concrete over mud.
It was concrete over mud. We didn't realise that at the time. You know, I used to play with John Lara and Pat Kelly, and they're deceased now, both of them. But I started going with
the concrete must have been there when you were playing handball against the mud.
No, the concrete was there always, that I remember. Always was, you know. Always was. And we were actually playing handball up against the wall the day that De Valera came around to West Clare, and he met Kathleen Telty brought to school. So we had forgotten about Dave coming around. So when his car over the road, they had to stop because we never saw it coming.
That was 1966 when he was running for re-election.
It was that time, I'd say. It was. I remember that, you know. So then John Lerner's grandmother, she was Neil Hill.
We leave it at that. Those of you who don't know the story of the 1966 election, Kathleen Talty was from Rahanishka, the next townland, and she had helped to spring De Valera out of Lincoln Jail during the War of Independence. She baked a cake and brought it into him and minded him in her house while he was on the run before they got him back to Ireland. So that was, as we're going into now, a presidential election in 1966. Dev was running for his second term and he was canvassing and came to West Clare and decided he wanted to meet Kathleen, who he mightn't have seen since 1922. She had just moved back to live with her niece, May Talty, who I mentioned earlier. And the meeting was set up outside Querrin Schoolhouse. We had a talk in the library in Kilkee about a month or two ago about Kathleen Talty. So I didn't realize, I've seen that photo of Dev and Kathleen Talty at Querrin School many times. And I think the car might be in it, but I didn't realize he had to stop for the handball game at Johnnie Mack's Cross on his way to Querrin. So there's lots more. I got about 45 minutes of wonderful stories about Johnnie from Liam, and they will eventually be made available through Cuimhnigh and Clore. There are some other links there on my webpage. And finally, many people I want to thank. Congella Maguire. I see Tori McMurrin here, John O'Malley, Joe Lenan and Dick Cronin in Clare County Council, the Heritage Council for funding the research, Robbie who's here, Paul O'Brien of our own society, Aileen from Clare Roots Society for doing the recording, Lily who's down the back there taking photos for organising this week's events. I also got advice from Sarah McCutcheon in Limerick City and County Council, Barry O'Reilly in the National Monument Service, Michael Talty and his predecessor Maureen Comber helped me. Those photographs taken in 1978 are available on the Clare County Library website thanks to Maureen's work. Paula Carroll from Quivniv and Clore advised me on the oral history. John O'Brien from Shannon from the Hastings Farmhouse Restoration Project also gave advice. There's a copy of the Clare Champion over there from May with 2 articles side by side, one about the council ploughing money into restoring the Hastings Farmhouse, a mud house in Shannon, and right beside it, the council about to pull down the mud house in Tullaroe. And Michael McNamara, my cousin who sold the house and tolerated my interfering in his attempts to sell the house to the council, but thankfully it all came good in the end. So thank you all very much for coming. I'm happy to answer any questions in the room or any questions if there's anyone actually watching us online. There's a few questions. And Robbie has a roving mic, which he's turning on. So if you want your questions to be heard by our remote audience and those watching the recording later, please don't ask until you have the mic in your hand. Any questions?
Any questions or comments? There's always one.
There's always one. Michael O'Connell.
Michael O'Connell, excuse me, my voice is not great.
You still have to shout, Michael, for the people in the room.
I know, but my throat isn't great, so I mightn't be able to shout too well. But the story about Johnnie Mack, and I know Johnnie Mack and the house, but Johnny, that corner there was the top of a little hill, and about a quarter of a mile further south, heading towards Querrin, was another hill. But I remember a time when the road was level all the way from the 2 hills. Back in 1955, the council decided to do a major job on the section of the road, about a quarter of a mile, and they decided to just on bog, you know. If you know, going over a bog, you go over a bog going to Kilkee every day, a bog road there outside Killush there, near Maesta. You're travelling over a bog road there. There's about 30 feet of bog there that you travel over. And also near the Gaelic grounds in Kilkee, that's bog there as well. But council decided it was there was more traffic, you know, like trucks and so on, starting to travel on the road. And the road was very high. I mean, it was about 30 feet up off the ground, and you had these trucks coming along between the 2 hills. They could have peeled over, so the council decided to cut the turf away. The road was closed for 2 years, and the turf, there was a load, it was all hand cutting. They cut with law, and of course, like the normal way of cutting the turf, and they dried the turf on both sides of the road out in the fields. Different farmers, Sullivan's would be one of them. Tommy Heafy had land there as well. There was Johnnie Mack had land. So the turf was dried in the fields and sold. And eventually, the engineer at the time was a guy by the name of Tuberty. He was a great engineer. So he put, like what was done centuries ago, he put down sallies on the mud, on the bottom floor. He put down sallies, and then put a layer of sally sticks along, and then put down another layer of some other trees, and then put concrete down it and reinforce it. And that road never gave a problem until a bunch of cowboys putting in the waterworks in West Clare. They went in around 1982. The water supply to West Clare, to all the farms and so on. They came along and the pipe had to go across there. Just to Johnnie Mack's, just at the bottom of the hill there, the pipe had to go across. They cut it up, and they had to cut through the concrete so the pipe level was right. And they cut through the concrete and just threw there more than up in. And for years there, it's never fixed since. There's always a bump there, you know. They completely messed it up, you know. So, but that was a brilliant job done on that road. So that's what it was. I remember the road was, you know, I remember being over in the field, you know, saving hay and looking across. I was up in the top of the hill looking across, and the cars going in and out to Kilkee, the tourists going in and out. That's back in the 50s, and they were up, you know, they were very high up, you know, they were flying along, you know. So
Thanks a million.
Thank you, Michael.
Any more questions? We have one comment online. Eileen Harvey in Chicago points out Crawford County to Omaha is about 80 miles. I suppose that wasn't too far to go and visit your daughter for Christmas in 1933.
And the closest other city would be Des Moines, and that would be 113 miles east.
So
Yeah.
it really is in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, oh, it is.
So who was the first Irish person to go to Crawford County, or the first West Clare person? I'd love to find out. Is that it? Luke at the back.
Good man, Luke.
Paddy, thank you very much. That's really insightful, really interesting, particularly the genealogical information. But in respect of the ruined stands now, what would you like to see? You alluded to earlier that there is a council heritage plan or development plan that's the details are yet to finalize on that. But that aside, I'm just curious as to what you could envisage for the site perhaps going forward.
I hoped it would be preserved. I hope if necessary they would have put in a set of traffic lights. I'm living in Killaloo. We have a set to spare. Our bridge has just been closed. I offered them to John O'Malley, but he didn't take me up on the offer. So I haven't even been able to think now since it was pulled down what could be done.
The damage has been done.
Damage has
We
been
can't go
done,
back.
unfortunately, yeah.
Well, on behalf of the audience here, I'd like to give a vote of thanks to our speakers. You don't have to see the amount of work that Paddy has put into this, and you don't have to see, and you can easily see the passion he has for it. We're grateful to have him in our community, and thank you both.